The Christmas Letters, Celebrating Advent with Those Who Told the Story First, by Magrey R. DeVega. Chapter 2. Love Incarnate, the Word of Life Revealed. Incarnate with one another. But the letter of 1 John does not just talk about Jesus as the incarnate revelation of God to humans. It goes one step further to remind us of how God has called each of us to be the conduit of God's love with one another. The incarnation that we anticipate at Advent is not just in the arrival of Jesus in our lives. It is in the expectation that we will take the presence of Jesus and, by water and blood, become agents of love and healing in our relationships with one another. This central premise of 1 John is found in this key verse. What we have seen and heard, we also announce it to you, so that you can have fellowship with us. Our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. We are writing these things so that our joy can be complete. 1 John chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. That word fellowship is a key word in the New Testament. In Greek, it is koinonia, which has a range of translations in English. Most often, it is translated as fellowship, as it is in this verse. It can also be translated as sharing, participation, and contribution. In other words, a community of Christians in fellowship with one another is, in its essence, an active participation in which people freely give and receive acts of generosity and love with one another. What is more interesting is that the word koinonia has its root in the word koinos, which can be translated in two somewhat oppositional ways. The first is common, in the sense of shared, united, and holding together. Think about how Christians are to hold things in common, such as beliefs, convictions, values, and truths. All the believers were united and shared everything. Acts chapter 2, verse 44. The community of believers was one in heart and mind. None of them would say, "This is mine," about any of their possessions, but held everything in common. Acts chapter 4, verse 32. But the second way that koinos means common is in the sense of ordinary, mundane, and even profane. It is used in verses throughout the New Testament to describe things that Christians are supposed to avoid, things that are defiled and unclean. They saw some of his disciples eating food with unclean hands. They were eating without first ritually purifying their hands through washing. Mark chapter 7, verse 2. Peter exclaimed, "Absolutely not, Lord! I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." Acts chapter 10, verse 14. Fascinating. The same word koinos can describe both, one, Christian community sharing fully with one another, and two, the kinds of unclean attributes that God's people are taught to avoid. This means that true koinonia, fellowship with one another in Christ, is one where followers of Jesus both bring out the best in one another to be more loving and help one another avoid that which is sinful and unholy. That is why 1 John is filled with practical guidance on how to love one another, so that everyone can grow in their love of God and others. Fellowship in truth and love. So, since we have received the ultimate revelation of God's love in the incarnation of Jesus, and if our task is to embody that love in our relationships with one another, how do we make that happen? What does full fellowship with one another look like? Taken together, the Gospel of John and the letter of 1 John identify two key qualities that should guide our relationships with God and one another: truth and love. To put it most simply, John's gospel is about truth, and John's epistles are about love. John's gospel is about believing and being clear about who Jesus is. John's gospel contains the words truth and belief far more than any other book in the Bible. And John's epistles are primarily about love and living fully in the way of Jesus. So, in order to have full koinonia with one another, in which we prompt one another toward more loving participation and help one another refrain from actions that are sinful and unhealthy, here is the question we can ask. How can we live in ways that are both truthful and loving with one another? Think about the importance of holding truth and love in balance with one another, especially in the kinds of hard decisions and difficult conversations that you have had with other people. Discussions that have an imbalance between truth and love can be at best unhealthy and at worst harmful. Speaking truth without love can lead to condescension, name-calling, and entrenched tribalism. But love without truth can lead to a drift in basic morals and values, a loss of ideals, and a failure to move forward as a society. Author Warren Wiersbe once said, "Truth without love is brutality, and love without truth is hypocrisy." We need both truth and love in the way we talk to one another, debate important issues, and have koinonia with one another. Consider a strained relationship you have had at some point in your life with someone you love. In order for any loving relationship to work, whether it be in a marriage or a family relationship or a close friendship, there needs to be a balance between speaking and hearing truth, and doing so with love. In a relationship, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is to speak truth to someone, along with being open to hearing hard truths about yourself. And sometimes, the most truthful thing to do is to love that person, even when it's hard. Author Timothy Keller, in his book on marriage, put it this way: love without truth is sentimentality. It supports and affirms us, but keeps us in denial about our flaws. Truth without love is harshness. It gives us information, but in such a way that we cannot really hear it. For Christian people, truth and love are two sides of the same coin, especially for Methodists like me and others in the Wesleyan tradition. I once heard a lecture by my friend Dr. Paul Chilcote, a longtime professor of Wesleyan studies. He shared the story of John Wesley's two conversion experiences. The first one is well known. We call it his Aldersgate experience. Wesley was struggling in his faith about how to know, how to believe that he was truly saved. One night, on May 24th, 1738, he stumbled upon a small group gathering in a room on Aldersgate Street. The group was studying the Bible together, and the leader was reading from Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans about how God has done everything necessary for us to be saved, and our salvation required no merit or works on our part. Wesley would write what happened next. While the leader was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. That was Wesley's first conversion experience, according to Dr. Chilcote, in which John Wesley developed a passion for the truth. But there would be a second conversion experience for Wesley. He would take the truth of the gospel and preach it near and far, out in the countryside and in the city. And as he traveled throughout England, his eyes were opened to the physical needs of the people around him. The poor, those living on the streets, the sick lacking adequate health care, the illiterate in need of proper schooling, the hungry in need of food. And as a result, John Wesley became convicted to address the real-life needs of people and make that a part of his mission. This was Wesley's second conversion experience, according to Dr. Chilcote. From that moment on, Wesley not only had a passion for the truth, he had a compassion for people. I've never forgotten that statement. That is how to live both the Gospel of John and the epistles of John. In every aspect of our lives, in our relationships with others, and in the character of our society, we need to develop a passion for truth and a compassion for people. So, As we march toward Christmas Eve, let's explore a few practical ways that you might live with both truth and love by seeing how John's epistle teaches us both. First, let's look at truth through the lens of 1 John.